Thank you. Thank you, Adriana. Um, Thank you so much for being here today. As Adriana mentioned, my sharing today is about Colombia's Truth Commission as a space for positive peace. Yes, my name is Ángela Guerra. I was born in Bogotá, Colombia, and I've been living in Canada for the past 8 years. Yes, as Adriana mentioned, I'm currently doing my PhD in peace building and citizenship education, and I'm working with the Commission of Truth from Colombia by interviewing victims of the armed conflict that are currently living in Canada. In the next slide, I want to very briefly explain to you a little bit of the context of Colombia, but before doing that, I want to explain to you what is going to be the order of this talk. So I will briefly, before talking about the Commission of Truth, I want to explain some parties involved in the armed conflict using some framework of peace and conflict theories. I also want to explain some of the causes that trigger violence in Colombia in the first place. Then I also want to talk about the ways how violence has been addressed in Colombia, including a peace process where the Commission of Truth was born. I will explain why the Commission of Truth was born, what they do, how we do our work, why we do our work in Canada, and what is the kind of methodology we're using. And of course, I will explain how are we organized in Canada and what are the kind of challenges that we're facing right now. So before before going into the work of the Commission of Truth, I will just briefly explain to you, many of you are not necessarily from Colombia, so I want to give you a brief context that helps understand the conflict. So as you can see in the map, Colombia is bounded by the Caribbean Sea, the northwest by Panama, the south by Ecuador and Peru, the east by Venezuela, and the southeast by Brazil, the west by the Pacific Ocean. Colombia comprises 32 departments, all known as, or as in Canada, they name it provinces, and the capital district is Bogotá. Colombia has a very ethnically and linguistically diverse population. We have a multicultural heritage reflecting influences by Amerindian civilization, Spanish settlement, African heritage, immigration from Europe and Middle East. However, beginning in the 1960s, the country started to suffer the world's longest armed conflict and political violence, which escalated even more in the 1990s. In the next slide, I want to show you a little bit of the parties involved in this conflict. So just to give you an idea, well, Colombia has experienced more than 5 decades of armed conflict involving various actors. We have responsible, we have affected parties. At a point in history, there were 9 parties involved, but I will briefly describe some of them by using this line that portrays actors that were on different sides. At one side, we have guerrilla groups that were against the Colombian state. On the other side, we have the army defending the state, and of course also paramilitary forces fighting against guerrillas. So let's go one by one, just very briefly. One of the most responsible or known responsible party involved in the armed conflict was the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, also known as the FARC. This was the largest guerrilla group in Colombia. They were established in 1964, and they fought for a revolutionary state based on Marxist-Leninist principles. And I speak in past because it's important to acknowledge that this group dismantled as a guerrilla after signing a peace process with the Colombian government in 2016. There are still some factions of dissidents, but the FARC moved from being fighting against the state to now currently being part of the state as a political party after signing a peace process with the government in 2016. However, when FARC was a guerrilla, and according to historical accounts, this group used kidnapping, selective assassinations, terrorist attacks, as well as forced recruitment, forced displacement, land grabbing, and attacks on civilian property. Another responsible actor of the armed conflict is known as the National Liberation Army, or the ELN. This is a left-wing Marxist guerrilla group that also was set up in 1964. They are still active, causing harm in regions, still severely affecting populations. Another guerrilla group has appeared in the 1970s. It was a smaller yet significant guerrilla group called the Popular Liberation Army, or EPL. It was also formed by the Communist Youth as well as the Communist Marxist-Leninist Party. Another actor involved in the conflict are the military forces of Colombia. They are responsible for developing and implementing the government strategy in order to fight against the guerrilla groups on the ground. However, human rights groups have accused the army of collaborating with paramilitary groups and doing extrajudicial killings, which took such forms as arbitrary detentions, torture, selective assassinations, and forced disappearances. Another actor involved are the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, also known as AUC, or paramilitary organizations, which were located in several regions and whose aim was basically to push back and ultimately extinguish the FARC and the ELN. They were founded in 1997 and they were disbanded from 2003 to 2006, but some factions still operate or have moved into micro drug cartels or criminal gangs known as BACRIMs. The paramilitary forces also executed massacres, selective assassinations, and forced disappearances. Within this crossfire among these responsible parties, we find the affected parties, which are millions of civilians. Yes, civilians have been often targeted by all of these parties. In fact, Colombia has the third largest population of internally displaced people in the world, with around 8 million people. Most of these people tend to be poor, indigenous, farmers, and Afro-Colombian who have suffered disproportionate levels of violence through the history of the conflict in the country. Today, there are a total of 8.5 million registered victims. From this number, 8 million have been displaced. Over 1 million have been directly and indirectly affected by homicides. Thousands have been threatened, affected by landmines, kidnapped, tortured, sexually abused, and disappeared. Over 1 million of the registered victims are Afro-Colombians, and around 400,000 belong to indigenous populations. In the next slide, I wanted to explain a peace and conflict framework to later very briefly discuss some of the causes of the armed conflict, of Colombian armed conflict. So in this slide, I wanted to synthesize the work of peace and conflict theorist Johan Galtung, who distinguished direct violence from indirect systemic violence. So imagine that this triangle is like an iceberg. Based on Galtung's theory, the visible part of the iceberg could be related to what he called as direct violence, which is visible as an iceberg, represented as the physical harm caused to others based on their attitudes and violent behaviors. But underneath the water, he said that there were indirect causes strictly related to instances of injustices that helped trigger violence or direct violence in the first place. Within this concept of indirect violence, Johan Galtung and Mark Ross distinguish two dimensions. On the one hand, we have the cultural, and on the other hand, we have the social structural dimensions of indirect systemic violence. The social structural dimension refers to the interests that affect people. In particular, they refer to the unequal social status and political power that various social identity groups have to fulfill their wants and needs. So let's think about those instances of social injustices, including lack of access to resources, to land, to health, to education, that opens up the space to poverty, inequality, unemployment, and so on. They also mention the cultural dimension that contributes to aggravate and normalize social injustices and violence against certain groups. So this is particularly referring to the beliefs, the assumptions, the narratives that reinforce certain members in order to produce a sense of affinity or hate towards others. So let's think, for instance, about those narratives that have to do with male chauvinism, machismo, or racism, or homophobia, or xenophobia, or Islamophobia, all of these narratives of hate that help to nurture and to escalate violence against certain groups. In the next slide, I wanted to, thank you. In the next slide, with this framework in mind, and instead of thinking about an iceberg, as in Colombia there are no icebergs, let's imagine a tree with some roots, just to briefly talk about some elements that help trigger direct violence in Colombia in the form of an armed conflict. This image could be more culturally relevant for a context such as Colombia. So if we follow this peace and conflict theorist as Johan Galton, direct violence in the armed conflict has been visible in the past 6 decades in Colombia through actions that include massacres, killings to many social leaders, assaults to populations, forced displacement to peasants, to indigenous, to Afro-Colombians, illegal recruitment of children by guerrilla groups, sexual assaults to women, men, children, LGBTQI communities, kidnappings, and just to name some. Actually, while growing up in Colombia, these were the images that I used to see of the armed conflict, the direct violence, the visible aspects, the harm caused from one party to another, and in the middle, the affected parties. But what is underneath this armed conflict? What happens underneath? What are the indirect aspects that actually created this conflict in the first place? So, for instance, at the social structural level, the country has suffered of extreme inequality. One aspect of extreme inequality experienced in the country is that of income. Colombia is on the top 10 most unequal countries in the world in terms of family income. Closely linked to income inequality, and of course playing an even more central role in Colombia's conflict, is the level of land concentration. So just to give you an example and a number, Colombia's population is about 50 million people, and just 0.4% of the population owns 62% of the country's best land. So there's a huge misdistribution of resources in the history of the country. This also, of course, includes a rural inequality that is huge, and concentration of land has also been done by groups such as guerrilla groups, expelling, expropriating these peasants and the indigenous and Afro-Colombians. This happened especially in the most intense periods of the conflict in the early 1980s and 2000, where armed groups acquired approximately 4.5 million of hectares of land in order to finance themselves through illegal economic activities such as drug trafficking. Of course, this gave place to displacement of people, and majority of these people owned some land at the time of their displacement, and now they're trying to get their lands back. But they were just unjustly dispossessed of their land. Another social structural cause that helps understand the eruption or triggering of violence was that related to political exclusion. Since the birth of the state in the first half of the 19th century, Colombian political life has been dominated by two political powerhouses, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. While there were real differences between the two parties, one commonality upon which there is much agreement is that neither represented the interest of the masses of Colombian society. And between 1953 to 1957, the two parties decided they would simply alternate power every 4 years over a 16-year period between 1958 to 1974. That was called the National Front. But this National Front, it formally excluded any third party from participating in the decision-making of the country or in the share of power. So these were conditions that were set for the creation of groups to challenge the authority of a state that was dominated by an elite seeking to maintain its power. And then, of course, this was the period when Colombia's guerrilla movements were born. As I mentioned earlier, the FARC, the ELN in 1964, the EPL and M19 in the 1970s. These groups unfortunately decided armed struggle because their peaceful means were not allowing them to advance in their causes. Another aspect has to do with weak and corrupt state. because throughout history there has been an absence of state institutions throughout much of the country, and institutions are very well corrupted. Colombian state has been known for its inability to reach rural regions with institutions aiming at education, health, and in general citizen well-being. There's an NGO called Transparency International, which monitors corruption around the world. And this NGO ranks Colombia 94th out of 175 countries on the Corruption Perception Index. According to this NGO, a staggering 80% of Colombians view their government as corrupt, and a slight majority, 52%, think corruption is actually getting worse. So there's an uneven and weak presence of the Colombian state throughout much of the country. And Julieta Lemaitre, which is one of the well-known scholars spending decades of forced displacement research, she says that in the war, the state is always late. Maybe not its army, but the constitutional state, the one that promotes aid, the one that responds with humanitarian assistance and poverty alleviation programs, the one that seeks to establish its power in remote areas through the provision of services and distribution of resources, has always been late. Another aspect at the social structural level of this conflict has to do with drug trafficking. Drug trafficking has played a major role in Colombia's armed conflict, as it has been the main source of income for the illegal groups involved in the violence. Undoubtedly, it has aggravated an already volatile situation by increasing the financial and armed power of illegal groups, but it's also seen as a symptom of a social structural conflict such as poverty, inequality, where many people find through drug trafficking an easy way to make money. Within the cultural dimension, we can also find various beliefs or assumptions and narratives that also have contributed along the history of the country to normalize violence and exclusion towards others. For instance, male chauvinism, machismo, has given space to aggravate gender-based violence, particularly sexual assaults to women, to girls, to children. Women in war has been seen as war, as trophies of war, due to these cultural beliefs that men conquer territories and also their female bodies. And there are also cultural narratives that nurture exclusion and hate, giving rise to racism against Afro-Colombian populations, against indigenous, homophobia against all the LGBTQI community. So the question is now how to dismantle these cultural narratives that contribute to escalate violence against others. And this is an important task of the Colombian Truth Commission by providing evidence of what happened, how these cultural narratives contributed to violence against certain parties, and what can be done to challenge non-violently these narratives, right? In this next slide, I just want to very briefly explain the ways that exist. There are three types of approaches that respond to violence and conflict. These are peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building. But peace and conflict theorist Johan Galton talked about a negative peace, which is seen as a temporary solution to limit violence, and positive peace as a space to find reconciliation, non-repetition, and peace building through democratic processes that change patterns and structures. So let's go one by one. So more inclined towards a negative peace, peacekeeping refers to control-based interventions, including self-regulation to stop or eliminate direct violence. It's negative in the sense that it does not address the social, structural, and cultural problems that helped escalate violence in the first place. It's negative peace in the sense that it's just a temporary solution to limit violence, but it's not a long-lasting peace. In fact, peace is not achieved by mainly ceasing fire. Peace with hunger, with inequality, with continuing social injustices, with continuing human rights violations can be achieved in the long term. So another approach to respond to conflicts and violence is called peacemaking. Peacemaking refers to negotiation of disagreements through dialogue to reach solutions that satisfy the parties involved. This is what happened in Colombia during various attempts of peace processes. But particularly in November 2016, after more than 4 years of intense negotiations, a final peace agreement between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrilla was signed. And this was a very important step in a country where escalated violence lasted more than 50 years, right? The third approach to address violence is called peace building. This is the goal of post-conflict of a post-conflict country such as Colombia. And it refers to a long-term process that aims to overcome indirect social, structural, and cultural dimensions of conflicts through democracy, through equity, through inclusion, reconciliation, acknowledgement of the truth, and participatory spaces to provide alternatives for non-repetition of violent events. So in other words, peace building aims to transform injustices that have led to direct violence by including peacemaking dialogue, collective decision-making, and problem-solving practices just to change institutional, structural, cultural patterns to make processes inclusive and also to denormalize social exclusion. So transformational change is essential for fostering a positive peace. A peace requiring not just the absence of direct physical violence, but also the elimination of structural violence, cultural violence, and other forms of repression and exclusion. As I said, there's no peace with inequalities or denial of human rights violations. And that's why the Commission of Truth is so important in a context such as the Colombian one. In the next slide, I just wanted to give you a context of why the Commission of Truth was created, how, where, in which context. So as I mentioned, during 4 years of intense negotiations, starting in 2012 and ending in 2016, two parties, the state, the government, and the guerrilla FARC, sat down to deal with aspects that needed to be discussed in order to reach to a peace agreement. So they thought about 6 points, which are key of the peace agreement. One has to do with the problem of rural areas and land. And so they proposed to do plans that could improve healthcare, education, housing, and drinking water services in order to improve the opportunities for rural people, to reconstruct rural roads, and to do, of course, a rural reform. Another aspect has to do with the political exclusion, right? One of the causes was they didn't have a voice, particularly the FARC. They didn't have a voice in order to express what they wanted, express their needs and wishes. So they proposed a space for political participation in order to open up spaces for other voices to talk. And this required a third point, which was the end of the conflict, the FARC disarmament, and get back to civil life. And that happened in 2016. A fourth aspect had to do with finding solutions to the problem of drug trafficking. However, in fact, drug trafficking has been increasing in the past years, even more than what it was before the armed conflict. And a fifth point where the Commission of Truth lands, it has to do with redressing harm of victims to actually satisfy their basic needs. A lot has been written about the role of armed parties, but less has been written about the harm to victims. This is where the Commission of Truth comes into place. And so this is the place where the Commission of Truth wants to be created. It started to be created as a temporary body with the aim of investigating past crimes, to document the causes, the consequences of the armed conflict, and the period of human rights abuses, in order to ensure accountability for what happened during this armed conflict, and to help facilitate social coexistence, reconciliation, and guarantees for non-repetition of the conflict. In the next slide, I just want to say that the Commission was founded in November 28th of 2018, and it's just for a 3-year period. So by November 2021, the Truth Commission needs to publish the final report. And something important about this is that the Commission of Truth works in coordination with other with other two institutions that are part of the integral system for truth, justice, repair, and non-repetition, which are, one is the special jurisdiction of peace, and the other one is the unit for the search of disappeared people, and the third one is the Truth Commission. The Truth Commission, unlike trials, they do not have prosecutorial power. This means that they cannot judge or condemn. Of course, truth commissions are not exceptional in Colombia. Many countries have already established their own truth commissions. Canada has one example. Canada had its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission in order to honor the truth of what happened in Canada's residential school system, where Aboriginal children were separated from their families in order to minimize and weaken family ties and cultural linkages, and to indoctrinate children into a new culture, the culture of the legally dominant Euro-Christian Canadian society. And this report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada provided evidence of what happened to these people, as well as recommendations to lead to reconciliation and non-repetition of these human rights violations. So yeah, and in the next slide, I want to talk about what is it that the Commission of Truth of Colombia does. What are the main objectives? So there are 4 main objectives that the Commission of Truth seeks. One is, of course, to contribute to the clarification of what happened, offer a broader explanation of the complexity of the armed conflict, and promote a shared understanding of what happened among society, especially of the less known aspects of the conflict, such as the impact of conflict on children, women, ethnic groups. A second objective is to promote and contribute to the recognition of the victims as citizens who saw their rights violated, and as political subjects of vital importance for the transformation of the country. And of course, they also want to contribute to the recognition of individual collective responsibilities by all those who directly or indirectly participated in the armed conflict, as a contribution to truth, to justice, to reparation, and non-repetition. So in general, the Commission of Truth from Colombia wants to recognize, gives a space to the whole society to know what happened in this legacy of violations and infractions as something that deserves everyone's rejection and that should not be repeated. A third objective has to do with promoting a social cohesion or convivencia in territories. A fourth objective has to do with identifying and promoting the necessary conditions for non-repetition. These objectives create the structural conditions to lay foundations, of course, for a stable, long-lasting peace or a positive peace. In the next slide, I briefly summarize 13 topics that the Commission of Truth wants to find evidence about in order to explain the origins and reasons of the continuity of the armed conflict. So there are 13 topics that have to do with human rights violations, collective responsibilities, impact among different parties, historical context, causes, why the conflict persisted for so long, in geographically why it was so extended, actions of the state, responsibilities of the state, responsibilities of guerrillas, paramilitaries. They also want to study the paramilitarism in all its dimensions, displacement, land grabbing, drug trafficking, but also the spaces for social resistance of these victims and the spaces for resilience in order to move on many communities, and positive transformation of institutions and organizations through recommendations. Now in the next slide, I want to I want to tell you a little bit of um, how we do our work. So we do our work through a participatory methodology based on respect towards participants, creating safe spaces in order to help someone to share with us what that person experienced in a safe and secure manner that is victim-centered. And the Commission wants to know what happened, where, how, by whom, why, a little bit of the context of the region, what kind of impacts did that person went through, what were the coping mechanisms to go through that. And this is done through interviews, individual interviews, collective interviews, and in-depth interviews. Collective interviews are more spaces of dialogue between victims or people that have suffered violent events that share a common circumstance. It can be the type of violation, age, gender, ethnicity, social organization, or place where they lived, or being harmed by a particular armed group. And in-depth interviews want to know a little bit more about the experience lived by someone. The Commission of Truth is giving a special focus on certain aspects, for instance, a special focus on gender in order to identify the impact of the armed conflict in the lives of women, of girls, LGBTQI communities, and explain why the main victims are women and girls, as well as to analyze the violence lived by LGBTQI communities, and also to show how violence in Colombia was nurtured in cultural narratives based on prejudices, exclusion against certain groups, and contribute, of course, to alternatives to challenge those cultural narratives. Another focus is it has to do with ethnicity. Colombia has many ethnic groups. We have natives, we have Black communities, we have Afro-Colombians, Raizales, Palenqueros, and the community of Rom. And well, they have, these ethnic groups have suffered a historical violence, very, very, very cruel. And so they are among the most affected population by the armed conflict, being violated of their rights, of their integrity, of their traditional places, sacred places, of their spaces of community. And so this wants to be really highlighted by the Commission of Truth. And a special focus also on the psychosocial support, which comes before interviews, during interviews, and after interviews, because it's really hard when you talk about your own experiences, which were dramatic. They can also trigger a lot of emotions. So we are also there to bring some psychosocial support and help them find coping mechanisms to carry on, right? One aspect in the next slide I want to share with you has to do with how are we doing our work now that we are under pandemic. So before pandemic, we carried this work in person, doing in-person interviews, and it was very nice because we were able to build more trust, you know, towards people. This is a very important aspect. However, when COVID-19 hit, the Commission had to reinvent itself and use virtual spaces to reach the people. This also talks about not everybody has a computer, not everybody has an internet connection. So this is a huge challenge of the Commission of Truth. But basically we're doing interviews through a secure website in private virtual rooms, and recordings of the interviews remain with the Commission of Truth, and they're only accessible to authorized members of the Commission. In the next slide, I want to share with you why we're doing this work in Canada. Why are we working in Canada? So something very important to highlight is that a lot has been written about internal displacement in Colombia. We know that the armed conflict expelled many population from their regions, giving rise to poverty belts in cities, in populations, but less is known about the impact of the armed conflict in refugees having to leave their country and become refugees. Life in exile is less visible in the history of Colombia. There's no public knowledge about this topic. So this is one aspect of the Commission of Truth that wants to be told. And I want to share some numbers with you. Canada is the third country that has received more Colombian refugees after Ecuador and Venezuela. So that's why we are working in Canada. As you can see from these numbers, Colombians started to arrive to Canada about the decades of the 80s, which responds to the historical moment that the conflict was living. This was like the cruelest moments of the rise of the armed conflict. And between 2001 and 2010, more than 25,000 Colombian refugees were received in Canada. By 2011 and 2016, the number decreased, but this image just shows the huge number of refugees seeking help from international communities, right? In the next slide, I want to highlight that in Canada's census of 2016, there are more than 31,000 Colombians living in Canada as refugees. However, when we go and try to look at the numbers that are registered in the unique register system of victims, only 10% of these refugees register themselves as victims, 3,187. 45% of Colombians, according to Canada's census of 2016, have immigrated to Canada under the status of refugees. And the main provinces where they're located are Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. Ontario with more than 28,000 and Quebec with more than 25,000 refugees. So yes, in the next slide, I want to highlight that there's a huge impact of life in exile. In total, there are more than 500,000 refugees, Colombian refugees around the world, people that have had to leave the country because of the armed conflict and that have needed protection, international protection. And the Commission of Truth believes that they deserve to be heard. So that's why there's a huge chapter about life in exile, and that's why we are doing the work with refugees here. This is something very pertinent for writings relations in the Central Hub, because my understanding is that the focus of your work are with immigrants and refugees. So this is a question, the impact of life in exile is a question that writings relations is doing every day. There's a huge impact to arrive to a country with its own difficulties and also with its own unjust system. Many people arrive as victims, but also as settlers, right, to this new country. So basically, the Commission of Truth wants to promote the participation of victims and responsible parties, because this is important to highlight. We not only interview victims, but we also interview responsible parties living outside Colombia. And this is what differentiates our work from other truth commissions. So we are trying to assess the impact by asking them, for instance, what were the reasons that brought them to leave Colombia? How was the arrival to Canada? What kind of challenges they experienced? And many challenges. They tell us about many challenges, including, for instance, having to learn a new language, learn to move in a new culture with a very strong weather conditions that are like extreme warm and extreme cold, a place where they have no network, no connections, and they have to start their lives from zero, right? So there's a huge impact in how they find coping mechanisms to to move on. So it's like analyze the impact, the double impact, not only of the experienced violence in Colombia, but also the impact of their difficult conditions as immigrants, because not all immigrants are in the same conditions. Some of them perhaps could have been very good, amazing social leaders in Colombia, very well known, but here they just need to find new ways to make their livings. So it's very hard. In the next slide, I just want to show you a picture of our group, of our team in Canada. We are located in three, we call them nodes, in three provinces. We are located in Ontario, we are located in Quebec, and we are located in British Columbia. I am part of the team of Ontario, and we divided our tasks. This is a picture that we took the weekend of our training. It happened in September 2019 with of course with the commission, with people from Bogota, that explained to us basically also what I'm sharing with you today, and training how to do these interviews and how to do community engagement, how to reach to Colombia, and how to reach with organizations, NGOs that work with refugees in order to disseminate our work and get more people interested into sharing their lived experiences. So we are divided in teams. We have a logistics team, we have a cultural and events team, which shares some movies and some experiences about Colombia. We have a team of psychosocial support, which is very important, and a team of interviewers, and I belong to the team of interviewers. The next slide highlights a little bit the strategies that we've implemented as Commission of Truth. All strategies have been participatory, open to others, engaging others. The first strategy that we did was create a landing page for people to understand what was the Commission of Truth, to fill out their information so that we could contact them and have conversations, pre-interviews, in order to build trust and build network. That is very important. We have also a Facebook page where we have Facebook Live events. We have online presentations. The Commission of Truth has done a very important job in sharing and disseminating their work. They're not just waiting until the final report to be published, but they're constantly doing Facebook Live events with guests, with victims, with responsible parties of the armed conflict, in order to share their stories and their truths in different regions of the country. So these all events are shared also by our Facebook page. And we also had a press conference. We received a lot of support of Canadian media. They heard us. They actually wrote various and several news articles, and we also received huge support from NGOs and from agencies working with refugees and community organizations in order to disseminate our work. In the next slide, I just show some of the, very briefly, some of the news articles that have been published in Canadian media. And this has helped us to reach to more Colombians, and this has helped us to get more testimonies and to talk to more people and start to build a Colombian community, which is very hard to build when there's so many harm. Colombian polarization is not only present in the country, but also abroad, and we feel it here. It's very hard to build community with Colombians. So we're trying to do that, right? Not only to get their testimony, but also to build a community of people living in Canada. The next slide is about the challenges we have experienced in Canada doing our process. So we've faced a lot of challenges in order to disseminate our work. So especially because Colombians in Canada, they have a lot of lack of trust, right? There's fear of retaliation. Many fear if they share with us their testimony. They still have families in Colombia and they still have friends with whom they worked with, and they fear that something could happen because they don't trust in the institutions of the state. They don't trust in online spaces. There's still this huge polarization in the country, and of course there's people that are against the peace process and its implementation, that do not believe that what the Commission of Truth is doing will do something to change. So yeah, many challenges faced, including a fragmentation among Colombians community that we're trying to work with, right? Through cultural events, doing, yeah, like spaces in Facebook, creating groups, but it's a challenge. And yeah, just to conclude, I just want to finish this presentation by saying that Colombian peace is not merely achieved with the ceasefire reached between the FARC and the government. In fact, violence is still very present in the country. There are still massacres occurring against social leaders, against young people. And in order to reach a sustainable peace, the social, structural, and cultural dimensions that triggered violence in Colombia in the first place need to be addressed. So how can this be achieved? And this is where truth commissions can be spaces for a positive peace, because Colombia's Truth Commission has the purpose to address the past in order to also suggest change of practices and even relationships in the future. This is done in a way that respects and honors those who were affected by various types of violence and abuses. Why did I call my presentation as Commission of Truth as a space for positive peace? Because part of a Truth Commission's role is to contribute to the understanding of the causes of the armed conflict, recognizing victims, honoring them, and making recommendations based on their investigation into past violence and injustices to prevent such abuses from reoccurring. In this sense, the report that will be created by Colombia's Truth Commission aims to capture a vision of the just future and the particular transformations required to move society towards a sustainable, positive peace with more stability and often more spaces for democratization. So Truth Commission encouraged public acknowledgement of past conflict to transform and reconcile the present and future, with recommendations for promoting social cohesion, reconciliation, and non-repetition. This is what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much. I would love to hear your